Welcome to Reiki Cafe Radio. I'm your host, Christine Renee, and I am joined with a special guest today. Justin Stein, Dr. Justin Stein is with us to talk about Reiki history. And I have read, if you're following me over on social media, I have been reading his Alternate Currents published book, and I got so much out of it. And it is highlighted, tagged, like I really got into it. I shared numerous reels on my Facebook page. And part of it was that like every few pages, it was like a huge aha moment. So I really wanted to invite Justin to come on as kind of the leading Reiki historian right now to just kind of help me fill in blanks and fill in blanks for you as well, and kind of help you spur your mind. Like there's more depth to the Reiki history that we have gotten. And this is an excellent book. So I really do highly recommend, if you are teaching Reiki in any capacity, you need to have this on your bookshelf. So welcome, Justin. Thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about I know that you got your PhD basically in Reiki history. Is there anything more to that? Like, I know you've been involved in Reiki for a very long time. Kind of help us know like how you got into it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Christine, both for the invitation to be on your show, but also for your numerous and deep and personal, videos responding to the book. And it's like a really, I think, unique and special opportunity for an author to watch like someone reading your book and kind of like responding to it, because it's like one of those things where when you're sending it off into the world, you're never really sure how it's going to be received. So that kind of, it's like, it's also funny, like in intellectual history, social history, a lot of times when we talk about, oh, this book kind of changed things, there's this kind of sometimes lack of what we call like reception history, which is like how individual readers actually took it, right? Like the historian
Yes.
later is trying to piece together, how did this influence people? And you were like, this is how this, page 32 is changing my life. This is how page 74 is changing. So it was like such a detailed, like granular look at someone's journey through the book. It was like a really special thing. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm like, I hope Justin is appreciating this, or at least letting it fall, because I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you could take the book. Like there's a part of it that's like, well, clearly Miss Takata wasn't following, do your work honestly because of X, Y, and Z. Like you could have that perspective, but I really want people like to read it to really understand, like there's so much more depth to the history lessons that we typically receive, especially in the West. And I would love for you to kind of just kick us off in that conversation.
Yeah, well, I'll try to get to your other question too, but the one thing I just want to say about that quickly is that, like, I think one thing that you were saying in your videos, and a lot of people have said to me about the book, is that it really humanizes her.
Yes.
And so, like, I think that was one of my goals, was like, she wasn't a saint and she wasn't a villain. She was a human being who was doing her best, who against incredible odds, someone who had a sixth grade education, grew up on a plantation. Her parents are plantation workers, and went on to become like not only personally successful, but take this therapy that she learned out of, thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of similar therapies being practiced in Japan at that time, and catapulted it into global prominence, and where it is, in some sense, like the dominant therapy in this little world that we inhabit, where, if you want to be a body worker today, all over the world, right? You're probably going to learn Reiki at some point, right? As part of your training, as part of your process, even if you don't end up being, primarily identifying as a Reiki practitioner. I mean, it's really remarkable. And that wouldn't have happened without Hayao Takata, so that's part of what I'm trying to understand in the book, is like, who was she? How did she do this? What are the forces, external, internal, that caused her to, adapt the practice in certain ways? And so that
absolutely. Well, and it's so fascinating. It's fascinating in the fact that, like, what I kept seeing was like, wow, she really was an entrepreneur from a very young age. She just embraced that culture of like, okay, I got to make it and I got to do it myself. And I'm going to just take all of the tools and opportunities and utilize them to the fullest extent possible. And I'm like, that's honorable. Like, I see that. I'm like, I mean, the amount of students she had and the amount of influence she had and the way she networked and that the way she used social hierarchies and all of the things was just really impressive.
Yeah.
And
And going from being this like racialized second
yes,
class citizen in an American territory to like having celebrities write her letters saying, you know, Elizabeth Taylor wants you to come treat her or whatever. I mean, it's like
yeah,
it's really this incredible
it's incredible.
transformation.
Like,
Yeah.
and so I love that aspect of like, I mean, we didn't know that part of her story either. Right. So it wasn't just like we don't know a lot about the Japanese history, which I'm fascinated with, but we didn't really know the full extent of Takata's hardships and her struggles and the way she overcome that. So I really do appreciate too, just the Hawaiian history that was included, because
Yeah.
I didn't know how that went down. I didn't know how the Hawaiian um, monarchy like crumbled through the hands of these capitalistic white men. Like, I didn't know that story. And so
Yeah.
I think that it all puts a really beautiful framework of how this transnational spiritual therapy like got here. And that's really where you're writing from. And so I love it.
And I wanted to actually put a, a note out there to your listeners that if you buy the book and you get through the introduction and you're doing good, and then you get to like Hawaiian plantation history and you're having a hard time connecting with that, it's okay to skim a couple of pages and get to the next Reiki part. Because like there is, you know, it is have a book where there is like historical context for
Yes.
a couple of pages, and then we get back to the Reiki story, and then there's some historical context, and we get back to the Reiki story. And so there's no wrong way to read the book. I just want
I
to say that 'cause
appreciate that.
I think some people hit like a more historical section about it's not specifically about Reiki, and I think they get a little bit maybe overwhelmed or so
Yeah.
then they put it down and they don't pick it back up. So I just want
Yeah.
to put that out there that
I
you can
agree wholeheartedly. Like, pick it back up, just
choose
keep
your own
going.
adventure.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Like, I feel like there was definitely like chunks of it. I'm like, okay, I'm reading this. Okay, come back to the Reiki part. And
Yeah. So
but it was important. I do feel like having that context
yeah.
does really help lay the groundwork for where she was. Like, if we didn't understand that, what plantation workers were like and the generational issues that they were facing of being like second generation, you know, Japanese Americans, like, we wouldn't have the context. So I really do appreciate it. And I would
Yeah, but just like I want to be supportive of diverse
absolutely.
Reiki practices, I want to be
Yes,
supportive of diverse reading practices. And
absolutely.
it's okay to skip a page or two here and there. Like
And I'm
you
like, and
know,
on that note,
no one's gonna come after you.
when are you going to put this on Audible?
I know. I need to talk to the press again about it. We talked about it, and I'd like to read it. You know, I haven't. Although sometimes would read sections out loud to my wife, who I think is one of these readers who maybe gets stuck down in the historical details a little bit. And sometimes I'm reading a sentence, I'm like, this sentence is too long. I should not have made it so long. So, but yeah, maybe I think with the audiobook you can revise a little bit. So maybe that would be
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Like, skip ahead,
so
skip ahead.
you'd asked a little bit about my story and my path and how I ended up doing a PhD in Reiki
Yes.
history. And I'll try to do a shorter version of that story because
I appreciate that. Thank you.
But basically, I got involved, and I tell this story a bit in the introduction as well, but I got involved with doing a different kind of energy work for healing that involved meditations and some hands-on work. It was called spiritual human yoga. It's a chakra-based practice. And at the same time as I was feeling like, wow, energy, it's amazing, you know, what's going on here, and kind of blowing my mind with that. I also did not necessarily feel good about the organization itself. I felt like they were kind of exploitative and manipulative. And so I was kind of grappling with all that. And then I was an undergraduate who went on a semester abroad to Japan. And I was seeing Japanese new religious movements that like Jorei and Mahikari and similar kind of things where it's like, okay, they're working with energy and they are organizations that like might have kind of power dynamics and what's going on with all that. So I ended up doing a master's and a PhD in religious studies and trying to understand. Originally, I wanted to do a comparative project of Reiki and new religious movements that have kind of what I consider to be kind of energy healing components to them, where Reiki is not like a religion, right? But it has similar ritual practices. It may be tapping in metaphysically. For religious studies, we try not to get into the metaphysics of like what or ontology, what's actually happening, but
Right.
kind of trying to look at the world through with a sympathetic gaze through a practitioner's eyes and try to understand what a practitioner's experiences are like, while also doing some critical analysis of social and cultural dynamics, in an organization or in a movement. And so I think as a practitioner and scholar, right? So I did Reiki training as a part of my research in 2001 and 2002. I was initiated the second degree in Takata style lineages. Then, since then, in other parts of my research, I have also pursued what's sometimes called like traditional Japanese Reiki, Dento Reiki, as another part of my research, but also my personal development. And then, so yeah, and then I ended up doing my PhD, getting a postdoc, right? Getting this book out into the world. I now am the chair of Asian Studies at a university in British Columbia. And I'm trying to, both working within the academic world and then also giving back to the Reiki community that's given me so much. And so that kind of like what someone talk about is like both sider or like scholar practitioner
Yes.
balance. And I think the book is supposed to be kind of like a crossover book where
Yes.
scholars can read it and hopefully, impact the way that they end up talking about different types of spiritual practice and cultural construction, cultural development in between different nations, transnational kind of things. And also that practitioners can read it and maybe inform their own understanding of their own practice in a way as well. So
yeah, I love that. Well, I'm so appreciative of your dedication to the history and the research that you've had access to. Like, I'm just all of it is really impressive. And I remember meeting you in Japan last year, and you and Olaf, I forget his last name, but you were, yes, and you guys were standing in the corner and you were looking over, like, look at this cool new text I found. And I was like, oh, I want to see. And you both looked at me like, you don't speak or read Japanese. Go away.
sorry.
I want to be in on that conversation, and I don't have access. So I'm really glad that there are pieces coming out that I do have access to. And I loved it. I'm like, there was no offense. I was like, oh, of course I can't read it.
Yeah. Well, Olaf's new book, I like am actually helping him with the final kind of edits of the manuscript right now, and it should be out. And there are translations of a lot of these early, like previously unseen early primary sources from the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. So that's very exciting. I've been waiting for his book to come out for years. I
Yeah.
cited it in my book, even though it wasn't, ready yet.
Right.
And it's going to be a kind of source book with some interpretation, but yeah, definitely
Another one to get your hands on.
yeah, I think it's going to be, yeah, anyway, it should be available kind of soon. Olaf, Bohm, and the O has an umlaut on it. Boom.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. I love it. I'm definitely your Reiki history geek at this point. You have converted me. So on that note, there's a couple of things in the book that kind of like blew my mind, because we have this like the like Reiki myths from Takata kind of crossed over, right? And so one in particular is where the 5 Reiki precepts came from. Like, the story I heard during my training was they were adopted from the Emperor Meiji. Is that how you say
Meiji.
it?
Mm-hmm.
Meiji. And in your book, I'm like, well, that's not quite it. Like, there was these poetry, but that wasn't necessarily these precepts. And like, tell me more about this. Like, because I feel like there's more there that I want to understand.
Okay, so the thing about the precepts coming from Emperor Meiji is based on a misinterpretation of one of the most important primary texts that was that we have about early Usui Reiki Ryoho, that was discovered in the 1980s but within the Japanese, kind of broader Japanese Reiki community, as Reiki was being brought back to Japan, right? So Takata lineage Reiki being reintroduced to Japan, and people were looking for like the historic roots of the practice, and they found Usui Sensei's memorial stone at Saihoji in Tokyo. And in that text, it's a little ambiguous where the precepts come from, and it's easy, I think, to misinterpret it as saying they come from Emperor Meiji. And so there's kind of this intermediate period of like, we're learning about early Reiki history, in Frank R. Java Petter's early books, right? Reiki Fire,
Yep.
and the story of Dr. Usui, and then the Spirit of Reiki, right? Which is this Petter Rand Lubeck book from I think 2000 or 2001. And I think that's where, and then also not only from there, but then also Phyllis Furumoto also had her own translation done of the memorial. And I think from both of those sources, so both from the kind of, Rand or Java, Lubeck kind of, non-Usui Shiki Ryoho, right? Kind of the kind of, I don't know, newer lineages or something that developed after Takata. And then of course, our Java eventually becomes Jikiden, right?
Right.
But then there's that kind of non Usui Shiki Ryoho, and then even within Usui Shiki Ryoho, right, which is the Reiki Alliance and Phyllis Furumoto and Paul Mitchell, right? I think that in both of those streams, there was a period for a while where they were saying the precepts have to do with the Emperor Meiji, and it's, I think, a misinterpretation of the memorial stone. So it's nobody's like fault, really. Is nobody trying to push a false narrative. I think it was the best that people were doing based on the information they had at the time.
Yeah. So now what's the actual accuracy? Like what is it?
Yeah.
Where is it from? And then you have all these, like, what was it, 100 poetry or 120 poems from the emperor, and those were being practiced, and those clearly went away.
Right. Well, let me start with that one first, and then I'll come back
perfect.
to the five
Perfect.
precepts.
Perfect.
So yes, so an important, so this is why there was the misunderstanding, was that in the texts that we have from that period, they often talk about the five precepts and the teachings of Emperor Meiji in the same breath, but they're actually two different types of writing. And so the teachings from Emperor Meiji are these poems that are considered to have kind of spiritual messages, spiritual importance. And in the writing of the time, there's a book by Tomita Kaiji, who had studied Usui Reiki Ryoho and then taught his own method, which is very similar to Usui Reiki Ryoho. And he illuminates this. And also another author from the time, Mitsui Koshi, who is who is a very far right kind of emperor worshiping, nationalist. And both of them in their writing say that the goal of the practice is to kind of purify your kokoro, purify your heart and mind, and that through reciting the emperor's poetry, right, which is spiritually inspiring, you are purifying your kokoro, which allows you to have this stronger relationship with Reiki, which is going to allow you to heal yourself and other people, right? And so there's this kind of deified understanding of the emperor as a, pure, heavenly being who can enhance your spiritual development and your practice through, earnest recitation of his poetry with your hands in prayer position as part of a bigger practice called Hatsureho, right? Which is this kind of purification and activation of Reiki in your body. So that's part of that practice, is the imperial poetry. The
And
other
that
part of
was,
it,
and that piece of it was included in like the Usui Reiki Roho dojos, like their training facilities. That's what was happening.
yes. I mean, I've been asked by the Gakkai not to talk about how practice is today. So
Sure.
I have to be a little circumspect about what I say about that. But in Gakkai publications, going back to Usui's own lifetime,
Yes.
we have, collections of imperial poetry that and the way that it's described in Tomida's book is it's part of Hatsureho, where you are doing your meditation, where you're connecting with the source of Reiki. You've got your hands in gasho, in prayer position, and you're connecting your tanden, your like lower belly, with your hands. And as part of that, you're reciting imperial poetry. And it's all part of this broader practice to link yourself with the universe and purify your heart mind and be a good kind of channel for Reiki.
Beautiful. And then here comes our
The five
five
precepts.
precepts.
So the five precepts is another piece of that practice. But it's not just part of that practice. And I think probably the imperial poetry is not just part of that practice either, but there are things that you're supposed to actually realize in your day-to-day, everyday being in the world of, not getting angry, not worrying, being grateful, doing your duties, being kind to people. But reciting that practice is said to help, like an affirmation, right? To help enact it, that being committed to reciting this ritually helps actually transform your kokoro as well.
Mhm.
And maybe surprisingly for some people, what we think of as like the American school of like what's called New Thought, which is, I think, broadly known to people through things like The Secret or the Law of Attraction,
Sure.
right? Where our mind has the power to change our world. Um, this was being brought to Japan around that time. So about a decade before Usui Sensei, there was another teacher named Suzuki Bizan who wrote a book called teaching what he called his health philosophy. And his health philosophy was all about this, that the power of the mind, that if you can correct your mind, right, which in Japanese is kokoro often, right? So if you can, it's seishin and kokoro, they're kind of overlapping concepts. But if you can correct your mental aspect of your life, then your physical aspect will naturally heal as well, which is something we see in Usui Sensei's writing as well.
Right.
And as part of that practice, he taught this poem that's very, very close to the five precepts. And not only Usui Sensei, but other Reiki therapists of his time, like this guy Takagi Hidesuke, were adapting Suzuki's poem for their own Reiki Ryoho or Reiki Jutsu, and saying that this is basically an important tool to purify your kokoro, which allows you to work with Reiki. So the five precepts that we have not only have Japanese influences, but also seem to be influenced by American practices like affirmation, which Suzuki learned while studying in the US. He learned Christian Science in the US and was bringing Christian Science to Japan. So this is part of why my argument in the book is Reiki has always been a transnational practice, and what I call like a trans-Pacific practice, right? That there are elements of Japanese and American thought and practice in Reiki from the very beginning. And
And I think
because of
right
that, like
there,
attempts to get back to like the true, authentic, traditional Japanese Reiki, I'm going to say, are always kind of, in a sense, doomed to fail, in a sense, because the Reiki from 100 years ago was already kind of westernized a little bit. And so,
yes.
of course, some people then will say, okay, well, then we need to go back before Usui and go back to like older Japanese spiritual practices. And like, power to you. I'm not going to tell you not to do that, but I'm just saying that like, just because something is transnational doesn't mean it's not like quote unquote pure, that it's
Right.
not
Right.
profound, that it's not, efficacious, right? That like the quest for purity, I think, is sometimes yeah, not always the most productive.
Right.
But
Well,
but at the
and
same
I
time, of course,
appreciate that.
find the teacher, find the practice that you vibe with, do your thing. But I'm just saying, like, just because something changed over time, or just because something is influenced by multiple cultures, doesn't mean it's bad.
Yes. Okay. I'm like, can we just quote that, please? Right. Because I think that's it. There's so much of a struggle of like how like I think that was what really shook my foundation of going like, wow, there's Christian Science influences to our precepts. And that's like the foundation of so much of our practice, right? And going, that's okay. It's not a bad thing. Just because it has that influence doesn't mean we should, not practice it, and then going back deeper into like, okay, here's the kokoro and how do we heal this mind body connection, and the influences of deity yoga that were connecting with some of the Reiki symbols. And I find that just fascinating because it's also being borrowed from the esoteric Buddhism. And like, okay, what does that all mean? Because I think that is mostly new information to Western Reiki practitioners.
Okay. So a little bit what we were just talking about in terms of kind of this idea of the Meiji Emperor as this like heavenly being who can help correct our kokoro through uniting with him in reciting these poems. That is a logic that is consistent with an older Buddhist practice going back to India called deity yoga. And deity yoga is taught in what are sometimes called like esoteric forms of Buddhism, where it is a practice that you learn after receiving initiations, right? Which the Reiki
Okay.
initiations are also based on esoteric initiations. And it's not like a basic practice for practitioners. You have to kind of advance maybe through some levels. So again, the idea of first degree Reiki, you get the basic practices, the next degree of Reiki, maybe you're learning the symbols. And so the symbols, I think, are in part influenced by this esoteric Buddhist idea of deity yoga. And in deity yoga, it's basically that the practitioner is not working by themselves, but they are merging with a Buddha or a Bodhisattva or some other kind of being that has tremendous compassion for humanity, that wants to enact a more whole and loving and enlightened world. And so the practitioner, through doing things like doing certain things with your hands, saying certain mantras, visualizing certain kinds of things, that they call like the three mysteries in esoteric Buddhism, the body, speech, and mind, that you can actually kind of merge with this external being and be a presence for them in this world, right? And so there's this like non-dual merging of the practitioner and the Buddha or the Bodhisattva. And so then the Buddha and Bodhisattva can act through that practitioner in the world, which also, resembles some ideas about the Holy Spirit, maybe in Christian healing and other things as well. And so just because, this comes from a Buddhist thing, I think it's also been adapted, and resonates with, I think there's a reason that Reiki resonates with so many other practices, is because there is this kind of, I don't want to say universal logic, but let's say this common logic in a lot of spiritual healing practices, that the practitioner is not a healer themselves, but is an instrument for a greater power to work through them. And so anyway,
Yes.
I think that's the what deity
The
yoga
premise
was.
there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
well, no, and I appreciate that. And that was one of my other questions of like how the trainings were actually taught in the 1920s of like, here's your association membership and you come regularly and that's what you're paying for is the membership. And is the training included in that? Or is that just more of like a Reiki share? Like, I'm still kind of not sure how the trainings themselves, like I get that like, okay, here's the basics and this is what's included. and Shoden and Okuden, and how people have to kind of graduate up, and that they get more esoteric influences and deeper wisdom the higher you get. But was it part of the association, like the more you go, the more you get, or is it they're separated training?
So I think Olaf's book is going to help a little with this, but the short answer is we don't know all the details about how training worked in the 1920s. So the meetings that you referred to are often referred to as like Reiju-kai, right? And so Reiju is this ritual that has become thought of as like an initiation or an attunement. But as opposed to Takata lineage Reiki, right, where she basically made it, you get your initiations and then that's all you need for the rest of your life. In the Gakkai, at every meeting, the Shihan are giving the students, the instructors are giving the students Reiju. And so we don't know exactly how instruction was working, but that seems to be part of the process, is that regularly receiving Reiju is part of your progression. And also from what we know of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai, where Takata was an apprentice, actually what they call an uchideshi, living with Hayashi and his family, that there were students who were there daily, doing treatments on, people who would come into the clinic. And so it's clear there was a part of the training was basically supervised practice, where you are practicing on others regularly with your teacher there present, watching how you're practicing. And one can imagine correcting or giving suggestions. And so it seems like kind of like a martial art, right? Reiki was taught maybe through gradual, and also what we call first degree in Takata lineage, right? Shoden had a number of ranks as well. And so it seems that there was a much more gradual teaching rather than doing an intensive 4-day class or weekend workshop, right? That there was kind of a gradual, when this is a very Japanese thing, watch and learn kind of thing. They call it min narai, which means watch and learn. And so, there may not be a formal training. Okay, we've got 10 new students today. And so we're teaching the 10 new students, this is how you do this and this is how you do that. Rather, there's one new person who's there and everybody else already kind of knows what they're doing. And the new person learns from watching the others and following along. At the same time, there is some evidence that even in the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai, there may have been like week-long Reiju-kai, like a 4 or 5 day long meetings where a new person might go and attend every day for 5 days in a row, and of course have maybe a more accelerated advancement through attending a big session like that. And so it seems like those types of things, which at the beginning were just one type of meeting, right? The biggest type of meeting, became the model for what in Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai and then for Takata herself became the like first degree course.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I really appreciate that explanation, because I'm like, I think I get it, but let me.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is that it's not like he came out with a manual and be like, this is the way to do it. Right.
Right. Especially as an esoteric art, right? That there's certain things you put in print and there's other things you don't put in print.
Right. Well, yeah, here's this secret thing. If you want to know the mysteries, you got to show up and do the work.
That's right. That's right.
Right. I know we have referenced the term esoteric Buddhism a few times. I'm wondering if you can help our audience, understand what that means.
I mean, it's a good question. It's a contested term in the field. But basically, certain things that characterize esoteric Buddhism, I've already kind of mentioned a few of them. So that there are teachings that are only given to people who've received initiations, right? So that's an aspect of esotericism. The practice of deity yoga, the so-called 3 mysteries of mudra, mantra, and mandala. So where you have to do certain things with your body, with your speech, and with your mind in order to have that union with the deity and bring their power into the world. Those are, I think, some of the most commonly cited characteristics of esoteric Buddhism, and they're all visible to some degree in Reiki, but Reiki is not unique in this by any means. Many Japanese performing arts, craft traditions, other traditional arts also internalized aspects of esoteric practice, from swordsmanship to puppet theater to carpentry and, lacquerware making and ikebana, like a very broad field of Japanese arts have similar practices as well.
Well, and that makes sense. Like, it seems like there's such a steeped culture of the actual practice. It's so whatever practice it is, whether you're making pottery or you're serving tea, there's always such a depth to, it's not the way we make tea here. You know what I mean? Like, there's just such a much more deeper influence with everything that is going on. Would you say then that, like, Shugendo, is that a form of esoteric Buddhism?
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's usually considered to be distinct from esoteric Buddhism, but highly influenced by esoteric Buddhism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I mean, like, that's one of the things I personally am kind of geeking out right now is like, okay, I've got to study this Shugendoism and Eastern, like, esoteric Buddhism.
You don't have to study any of it. You could just do Reiki. But yeah, for people who want to engage with some of the practices that have similar roots as Reiki, Shugendo is certainly one of them. And for listeners who haven't heard that word before, Shugendo is a lineage of practice in Japan, or many lineages. It's a field of practice in Japan that has to do with going to the mountains and basically getting power in the mountains through often usually different types of austerity. So going into a cold waterfall, which is going to wash away your impurities while you recite maybe certain mantras or certain sutras, doing fasting and meditation in the mountains. And so it seems that Usui Sensei, some said in the past, oh, he was a Shugenja. We don't really know. But it seems that this idea of what he was doing on Kurama was at least influenced by certain ideas, maybe from Shugendo.
Yes, right. Well, I was at the World Heritage Pilgrimage Trail in Japan last year, and it's basically a Shugendo honoring trail. And so I remember reading the plaques and going, they go to the mountain to practice mountain asceticism to receive supernatural powers. If that has anything to do with Usui.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, cool. Curious if you can touch on a little bit about what happened to Sui Reiki Roho in Japan. While, like, your book still focuses on what's happening with Takata's timeline, but what was happening in Japan during that timeline?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It definitely deserves an article or something, because it was something I didn't include in the book. I do have a little bit about it. There's a World Religions and Spiritualities, like, online encyclopedia where I did write an article about Usui Reiki Ryoho in Japan. But basically, the Gakkai stayed a small. It shrank a lot. Before World War II, it was at its peak for membership. And after the war, kind of remained a small organization for many decades. It still exists. They, I think, are trying to balance their dedication to trying to preserve their practice with the need to have new members, so it survives for another century plus. And so I think that they have their own kind of internal debates about what's the proper way to proceed in terms of admitting new members and things, but they've basically remained a fairly small organization. And then there are also the famous student of Hayashi Sensei, Yamaguchi Chiyoko Sensei, and she was not originally trained as a shihan, right? She was not instructor in the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai, but her family were. She had an uncle and an aunt, I want to say. She had an uncle, definitely, and some other family members. I should have reviewed that before, who were shihan. And after Reiki came back to Japan in the late 80s and kind of got more popular in the 90s, she became a teacher, right? That she, I think, consulted with some of her family, like maybe, but she had been, a full practitioner of Reiki for 60 plus years, for like, I mean, and so she kind of helped preserve some of the teachings like from that other lineage, right? So there's the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai, but then there's also Hayashi Chujido's lineage, and so I think that got preserved through the Yamaguchi family, and so that helped spawn Jikiden Reiki, Komyo Reiki, and then there's Doi Hiroshi, who had learned some stuff in the Gakkai and had also learned some stuff from Takata lineage and tried to combine, or has, those two things into what he calls Gendai Reiki, which, he says is kind of a fusion of traditional Reiki and Western Reiki to create modern Reiki for a new world. So I think, the short answer though is that Usui Reiki Ryoho was continued to be practiced in Japan, but I think at a much smaller scale than it was before the war.
And I'm assuming that post-war, they had to be really quiet about it too.
I don't know enough about that. And it's something that I wish I had asked some of the elders in the Gakkai about more when they were younger and had maybe better memories, or when they were still alive, because some people have passed. But it is something that should be, I think, researched a bit more, is the Gakkai's own history. The question is how comfortable they are with that being shared with the outside world.
Of course.
Yeah, but there certainly was a strong relationship between the Gakkai and the Imperial Navy in the pre-war period. There was briefly a president in, I think, 46, who, immediately after the war, who was not a Navy officer, and then his reign was very short, and then another former Navy officer became the next president. And so, there's some question about maybe during the U.S. occupation, and also maybe after the war, when maybe the military was not seen in a positive light, that may have been a kind of stigma socially, or something, a reason to kind of keep under the radar a bit. But I don't know enough to really speak to that. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. At least there's like an idea, and like somewhere to research further.
Mm-hmm.
And, on that note, like I feel like there's definitely Hayashi rumors about how he died, and like, do you know the accuracy of, that he committed, a ceremonial suicide ritual, because, like what happened there?
I mean, I don't know that we're ever going to know the exact thing. There are different accounts. Yamaguchi Chiyoko has an account. Hawayo Takata had an account. It does seem that he took his own life, that he gathered his students. Takata's account is a bit more supernatural, that he had this power to burst the blood vessels in his brain. That similar story also appears in Autobiography of a Yogi, and she may have been influenced by Paramahamsa Yogananda, who was also someone who her student and patron Doris Duke was also a major supporter of Yogananda. It seems that Takata was familiar with Autobiography of a Yogi. It shows up in her notes. So that aspect of the story may have been influenced by other stories, but I think in the Jikiden lineage, they do talk about Hayashi taking his own life. I think I've heard someone refer to like seppuku. He definitely was not like disemboweling himself and beheaded. Seppuku, like the traditional Japanese ritual suicide would be that I do not think is what happened. But it's possible. I've heard other accounts that of him taking his own life in in less supernatural means and more thing. But yeah, the question, some people say, he knew that the Pacific War was coming and he had been in Hawaii and he didn't want to be interrogated by the Japanese military. He didn't want to be part of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I don't know if any of that is like independently verifiable.
Sure.
But it's a lot of different stories have circulated around that. It seems that the basic facts are true. Takata did travel to Japan. I think it's about 6 weeks before he dies, and she left maybe 2 weeks after he died. We have those records. So she was there. The records from Yamaguchi Chiyoko, stories from Tadao that are in that book, Women in Reiki, also kind of help verify the idea that Takata was offered Hayashi Sensei's, to become the next president, the second president of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai, and she declined, and Hayashi Chie, his wife, became the second president. Like, that's somewhat supported through some of the Yamaguchi family research and lore. So, I think a lot of parts of Takata's story are accurate, but I think there are also parts that she used as a teaching story to talk about her. And also maybe concerns about, Americans having a strong anti-suicide stigma, and that if she said her teacher took his life, which maybe in Japanese setting in 1940 was still something that could be seen as an honorable death,
Right.
maybe would be problematic for students in the U.S. So there's so many factors in why did she tell the stories she told. A
Yeah.
lot of them I do think are like teaching stories, and they have kind of parable aspects to them. So if they're not literally true, there is a truth in them that she's trying to impart on people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and I feel like now I kind of feel like we in this conversation, I'd like to kind of like, let's do some myth fact checking.
Okay. Yeah.
Because
And I'll
we're
try to
here,
keep my answers shorter. We could do lightning round.
Lightning round. Okay. Takata, naturopath or not? Like, I know she's gotten some certificates, but did she actually go to naturopathic school and like walk away with a 40-year degree?
She did not get a certificate from the school based on my research. I have no evidence that she got a certificate from the school she attended. She did take naturopathy courses in the summer of 1938 in Chicago. And she later got a piece of paper that said she was a doctor of naturopathy. And I don't know that those two things are related. Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally what it seemed like in the book. Like, I'm like, okay, there's a paper, but how verifiable that paper was to actually the education she got, a little.
The institution, I think, with the very interesting thing about both that certificate and also her first licensure as a minister, right? They both come from the same organization, and it seems to be like the 1940s version of, you send some money in the mail and they send you a certificate,
Right.
like maybe the Universal Life Church today, where you can get ordained as a minister online.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we also see
But she did take naturopathy classes, and she also did get a later minister license that required an examination and familiarity with the tenets of the church. So I feel like she did put in that effort, but like she also got these kind of like more,
yeah, like she did a little bit of both.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I see Reiki versus Reiki and some of the, interviews. What happened there?
That's just a transliteration thing from Japanese.
Okay.
That the Japanese use the same phoneme for both what we would say as L and R. And so how do you transliterate it? In Takata's earlier period, there hadn't been, I think, a standardized acceptance of like, is it L or R? It's in Japanese, it's R, which is different from what we have. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Isui's main clientele were also like high elitists. Can we assume that he was also charging a good high chunk of money like Takata was?
Yes. It seems that Takata's fees may have actually, in like conversion, obviously the currency exchange rate goes up and down, but like they were comparable, let's say, with the types of fees that were being charged in Japan. Membership fee for Usui. I believe it's in a footnote somewhere. I think it's about a month's salary for a laborer. So it was, yeah, it was
It was
for
a
an
big price.
audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usui, titled as a doctor. Myth?
I think it's again a Takata's attempt to translate sensei, but also make him appear more like an authority to her students in the US. But we don't have an equivalent for sensei, right?
Right. Right. It's true. Right. There's those pieces. What about Takata? Why do we think that Takata didn't go back to Japan herself in the 1970s?
So she did. We have her passports in the Takata archives. I
Oh,
don't talk about this in the book. It's just too much, but she did travel back and forth between Japan and Honolulu in the 60s and 70s. Um, and I don't know to what extent she knew about the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. In the 80s and or 90s, some of her master students, Shinobu Saito and Fran Brown, did visit the Gakkai and learned of their continued existence there. Whether Takata went to the Gakkai at that time, I don't know. It's interesting that in 74, there's a publication attributed to the Gakkai, which they now repudiate. And I mentioned this in a footnote somewhere, called the Shiori. And in there, they tell a story about Usui Sensei that's pretty similar to aspects of the Takata story, including like ripping his toenail off, I think, coming down the mountain. And was she there telling them her version of the story? And then it got written in a Japanese language publication attributed to the Gakkai in 1974. Like, I don't know. I mean, these are like some of the Reiki mysteries. To what degree did she know that Reiki was still being practiced in Japan? I'm not really sure, to be honest.
yeah.
Yeah.
I find that this to be one of my biggest, like, how did she not like connect?
Yeah. Well, one thing is that Hayashi Chie, I think, stopped teaching. And that was her, her
Her
teacher's wife,
teacher.
who she knew, who she was in touch with. There was a letter that we have that's in the Reiki Women in Reiki book that talks about it's from 1960 because it talks about the 20th anniversary of Hayashi Sensei's passing, and it says that she went out to the Ishikawa branch, which was the Yamaguchi family branch, and that they were still practicing there, and something about that. And so we know that, like, as of 1960, Takata knew there were other Hayashi lineage people still practicing. Like, she may have, but basically there was no major Reiki organization. She may have believed, because Hayashi Chie basically stopped the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai, even though there were still some branches that were still somewhat active. And so she may have thought the Hayashi thing is gone. She may not really have known about the Gakkai. I don't know to what extent she knew about the Gakkai.
Yeah.
And so she may have believed that it was basically died out in Japan, or she may have known, okay, there's some kind of folk practitioners, but no one is like actively teaching the way it was before the war.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Love that. Is there a myth that's going around that irks you or that you would like to dispel? Like, what's your number one question that you get or get ruffled by?
I mean, I think it's this idea that, like, there are people out there today teaching traditional Usui Reiki Ryoho, like, because that's a better form of practice, implicitly, and B, because, like, so that, like, that's like, okay, and that irks me for two reasons. One, because it implies that this is like the best way to do Reiki, and two, because it implies that we actually know exactly what people were practicing 100 years ago. And I think both of those are like flawed claims. I think you can get a tremendous amount of benefit from a number of these practices. Like, I personally love Hatsudeho. I think it's a great practice. I, think that Takata, in a sense, taught elements of it, but, like, kind of got rid of it, maybe in part because of concern of looking too cult-like or religious-like. I do think it's a really nice practice. Is my Reiki treatment better than that of someone who doesn't do Hatsudeho? Like, I do not think so. So I think if you're pursuing those practices because you find them personally meaningful and you're like just interested in it, great. But
Mhm.
I think that like there are so many ways to do Reiki. And although I also have my own skepticism of like some things on the other side of the spectrum where people are channeling, alien entities or Jesus or what have you, like that's not my practice either,
Right.
but I think that you can go a bit far in either direction. And but again, as I don't want to yuck anybody's yum. You know what I mean? Like,
I love
um,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
If that's what you feel your calling is, awesome. And also, like, I'm part of that, right? Like, as a historian, trying to recreate as much as we can find out about early practice. But again, I'm not like necessarily like hanging my shingle hat on a shingle, and whatever, like sign up and being like, come learn, the traditional Usui. So that's what I think is that like kind of if I think that if you're teaching your own particular interpretation of the traditional practices, that should be kind of forthright.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate all of this so much. Thank you so much for joining with me today.
Oh,
Like,
I love the questions, and again, also, right, these are my interpretations and opinions based on my work and my thing out, but like, yeah, if people are interested, please do read the book. But also, I always try to be, even though there's things I don't like about Facebook, I do try to be responsive on Facebook because it is a place where it seems like some of this conversation can continue. So if people have questions and check out, Justin B. Stein, Reiki Research, you can message me there. You can comment on things that I do there. And I do try to respond to people as best I can. I am about to leave for Japan. I don't know when this airs, so I am going to be traveling for a few weeks. But in general, this summer, I'm going to have some time this summer and fall. So if people want to reach out with any particular questions, I do try my best to answer as best I can.
absolutely. I love it. And know that you can get Justin Stein's book, Alternate Currents, on both Amazon and through the University of Hawaii. And I can't wait to see where you take this. Like, I'm like, are you going to do like a 5-hour history course? Promote
Yeah, I've
next.
done some of those. Usually trying to like a fundraiser for different organizations or things like that. Yeah, maybe I don't know. The thing is though, I have a day job, right? And so
Right,
and also
totally.
I'm trying to keep publishing new things too. So like I have a lot on my plate. The next big thing for me is like an edited volume, which is going to hopefully fill in some of the gaps from my book. Maybe with some of those things like you were asking about in this conversation. And so yeah, I feel like I don't need to keep rehashing necessarily all the
Totally.
old stuff. But yeah, I am trying to kind of push into new directions as well. And so yeah, that's one of my new projects. And also trying to get this book published. We did a big fundraiser where I did, some of those Reiki history things to raise money for the translation of that book by Tomita Kaiji. And we've submitted it for a number of publishers and haven't gotten a positive response yet, or have gotten positive responses, but no one's sending us a contract yet. So that's another big thing that we're really trying to get out there is the translation of the Tomita book. So
Very
yeah.
cool. Well, we will just continue to send Reiki towards all of those promising activities and publications, and we'll continue to watch what you put out into the world. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do for the Reiki community. I know I personally appreciate it, and I know others do as well. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.